Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Northern Virginia Technology Council and Virginia Tech for our Data Science Speaker Series event. Please welcome Tom Wotecki, Chairman of the Data Science Speaker Series and the Director of the Academy of Data Science at Virginia.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Data Science Speaker Series event featuring the co-founder and CEO of Gravy Analytics, Jeff White. His presentation will be followed by a panel of data science experts. It was great to see you in the social lounge networking before the program started. I hope to see you there after the program. This series is a partnership between the Northern Virginia Technology Council and Virginia Tech. It showcases the impact of data science in the modern era and explores the reality and future of data science. NVTC is the trade association representing the Capital Region's tech community. We unite, educate, and advocate for our members to advance a thriving tech ecosystem where we live and work. Virginia Tech is a comprehensive land-grant institution that enhances the quality of life in Virginia and throughout the world. Virginia Tech pushes the boundaries of knowledge by taking a hands-on, transdisciplinary approach to preparing scholars to be leaders and problem solvers. This series is made possible by our sponsors, Virginia Tech, our partner, Click, our keynote panel sponsor, and George Mason University, our silver sponsor. Thank you all for your support, and a special thank you to the NVTC business partners and academic partners. Their support enables NVTC to provide content and programming all year long. And they are Booz Allen Hamilton, CIT, the Center for Innovative Technology, the Consumer Technology Association, Deltec, Dominion Energy, George Mason University, Innova, KPMG, Maximus, Microsoft, Noblus, Northrop Grumman, Old Dominion University, PenFed Credit Union, Pillsbury, PNC, SAIC, Venable, Verizon, Virginia Tech, the policy advisor Hunton Andrews Kurth, the marketing agency advisor O2KL, and the PR and marketing advisor, the Merit Group. Thank you all for your support. Now it's my privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Jeff White. Jeff is the founder and chief executive officer of Gravy Analytics. As a serial entrepreneur, he's founded several companies and led them to successful exits. These companies include MySBX, sold to Deltec in 2009, and Blue Canopy, sold to a private investment firm in 2007. Jeff has over 2 decades of experience leading successful companies and was awarded the DC Technology Entrepreneur of the Year in 2011. And best of all, he's an alumnus of Virginia Tech. Go Hokies. Please welcome Jeff White.
Thank you, Tom, and I appreciate that. I've been fortunate to surround myself with some pretty fabulous teams in the area, so I give all the credit to them. If possible, I'm going to share my screen right now and walk us through a quick presentation just to outline the topic. So please, if you can't see my screen, or if you could let me know when you do, that would be great. But you should be seeing a PowerPoint presentation now.
Yep, we see that.
Awesome. So the topic of my discussion is location intelligence for social good. And whenever I talk about location intelligence, people have different perceptions and meanings of what that is. So I thought maybe I'd dig in a little bit and just kind of imagine a world if you could. So malaria kills 1 million people every year and a child every 30 seconds. Imagine if you could understand where malaria outbreaks are occurring, the people who are there, the migratory paths of those people, and help make a difference. That's location intelligence. Hunger affects 690 million people globally. What if you can understand where those supply chains are breaking down, how to get food to the people, and the migratory patterns of those people, where they are when they most need it, how to get them water. That's location intelligence. Floods. We all understand floods in and around the communities. We hear these things about flash flooding, but it kills 4,500 people worldwide. And that's just the deaths, not the counting all of the health impacts of floods. What if you could understand not where you think people might be, but where they actually are at the time of a flood? How do you impact first responders? How do you impact humanitarian aid? That's location intelligence. And lastly, think about just refugee crisis, right? More 70 million people worldwide are forced to leave their homes. The majority are children. What if we could understand that migratory path, points of origin, points of destination? We live in a world of finite resources, and so we have the ability to help these people, but we have to pick our battles, and location intelligence can inform us on how to make a difference into all of these scenarios. And that's what Gravy is. Gravy is a leading provider of real-world location intelligence, and effectively what we do is process billions of mobile location signals every day from millions of devices around the globe to help build aggregated location intelligence about the places and about where people go. And it doesn't have to be our world around mobile. You'll talk to some other people on the panel later. It can be satellite. It can be people on the ground. At the end of the day, it's just building a critical understanding of where people are, their associated mobility, and their intersection with places to make a difference, called social good for the sake of this discussion. So people always wonder, well, how do you get that data? So I'll spend a little bit of time just understanding how the sausage is made, because I think it might help provide some clearer context to how it's used and what it is and what it isn't when we speak about location intelligence. At its core, all of the data we get comes from people's use of mobile applications. There's a bit of software that sets on a mobile application. The consumer engages with that application, opts in to that application, leveraging its location and other bits of data for that consumer experience. And as the consumer uses the app, location data is aggregated, it's all anonymized, and it's fed into our thing called the GeoSignals Cloud. That GeoSignals Cloud processes all of those billions of aggregated data points every day into synthesized location intelligence to affect the use cases that we described earlier. And by the way, there's going to be time for questions at the end, so please feel free if there's any questions along the way. People always say, is this privacy friendly? Sounds creepy. I can assure you it's not. One is there's strict regulatory compliance with all of this data. People have heard about GDPR and CCPA in the US. It's all pseudonymized. All its information is aggregated. There's no personal identifiable information. And it's all 100% permission based. So all of this, a consumer always has, a user always has complete control of how this data is or isn't collected. It's all aggregated. It's always anonymized, and it's not real time or universal. The use cases that we described at the front of this presentation are all made available in a time lapse, right? It's got a lag, but that lag is important both for privacy, but it doesn't diminish their ability to make a difference in some of those use cases we just described. And last but not least, it is a highly regulated environment, as I said. So if anybody wants to get some light reading, you can go read the California Consumer Privacy Act or the GDPR in Europe. But the information is also, as I said, it's highly regulated as well. So how does all this information impact societal needs? How can we take what was not available at scale 10 years ago? People think smartphones have been around forever, but in reality, I'm not sure how old the iPhone exactly is, but it's still probably a teenager. But the proliferation of these devices has just unlocked enormous capabilities for us to understand our world in ways we couldn't before. So, and if you think about catastrophic events, the pace and the severity of these seems to be increasing. $81 billion by natural disasters in 2020 and growing. And we all are, entering in the United States, for example, hurricane season. So we'll be watching that. But whether it's floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, forest fires, these are major catastrophic events. And in some cases, they're man-made, right? They're human conflicts, right? We've seen a lot going on, for example, in Israel right now. The Beirut damaged by civil unrest, massive amounts of man-made catastrophic events, and then we all have lived through COVID in the past year. Not only a huge economic impact from COVID, but almost 3.8 million people lost their lives to that. Is there a way location intelligence can make a difference in these environments? And clearly the answer not only is yes, but there's a lot of emerging use cases around this. So it's really life-saving innovation. The technology didn't exist, at scale 10 years ago. It does today. And whether we think about any of these aspects, location intelligence today is not only saving economic impact, but it's saving lives. And I won't go into all of these with this, but think about low-risk delivery methods, right? One of the things that we're seeing more and more research and development going on right now is drone delivery, right? Not just Amazon being able to deliver your bag of cat litter, but actually getting humanitarian and relief to the people who most need it. One of the ways that we can think about doing this is through drones. Well, what's one of the things that are inhibiting our ability to optimize drone flight pathing today is understanding human mobility, right? How do we effectively fly drones to the areas that are in most need and still avoid populous areas? That's human mobility. Predictive models. During the COVID crisis, we always saw all these predictive models with contact tracing, right? That's location intelligence, understanding pathogen movements in a human population where mobility is dramatically impacted. We can develop predictive models, pathogen understanding based upon location intelligence, and even first responders. Where do we apply in a world of, as we already said, it's not unlimited resources? How do I get the biggest bang for our buck on getting those that need it most, the resources? It's it's location intelligence. All very emergent use cases. But it's not without peril. For anybody that has ever tried to get an Uber in a city, being frustrated by Google Maps or Apple Maps because it's jittery, right? There's problem with location data and subsequently location intelligence, and that's just the effective world we live in. These devices that we carry around in our pocket aren't 100% absolute. They're not always 100% accurate, and so it's one thing if a advertiser or a marketer makes a bad decision, but when lives are at stake, criticality of accuracy is important. Portability is important. So we spend a lot of time cleansing what is these 40 billion location signals a day. And in fact, 45% of them that we see come in are removed for a variety of reasons. They're not useful. They're inaccurate. They're not specific enough to actually provide real world intelligence that we need. And it's also expensive. Processing 40 billion transactions every day and maintaining the residual data of that gets expensive. So bad data is not only costing lives and inability to make a decision on the ground, it also is costing enormous things like storage cost and processing cost and other things. So we spend a lot of time at the source level ensuring that the output is accurate and trustworthy and transparent, so we can actually make a difference in the use cases that we describe. Obviously, you always heard the old adage, garbage in is garbage out, right? And that is so true in this world, right? How do you understand how to provide humanitarian aid when you're unsure of where the actual migratory patterns are of sub-Saharan Africa, right? So it starts with good quality data. and it lowers the barrier to entry for NGOs and humanitarian organizations and charitable organizations by lowering the processing costs, lowering the burden to actually get access to the data, lowering an analyst's time to understand COVID outbreak areas so they can get vaccines to those that are most in need, all starts to have a dramatic impact just with good quality data. And it starts there. So this just briefly just describes a lot about what we do on our side to make sure that the data that we're giving to these organizations and to those that need it is as clean and as accurate and as most trustworthy and transparent as we can be. And it starts with cleansing the data, deduping, validating, analyzing, and enriching it with other analytics. So for the use cases that are described, we can get those that are in most need the access right away. And we'll show you some examples of this, recent examples that we have worked on actually in action. So you'll get a sense of how that actually works in the real world. Location intelligence in action. So how can it be used for social good? A lot of the things that I described earlier on are very prolific use cases. We see the news. We see these events unfold. And what's not always told on the news is how they're optimizing aid, vaccines, food and water and other things to the people who are in most need and using location intelligence for that. But certainly capturing migration patterns is really, really important. So think about that flash flood example that we talked about, were people at that time in an affected area or not, right? Where do I go apply the resources? Where do I go, make the biggest bang for my buck in terms of applying this aid? Migration patterns are really important. Where we've seen this time and time again, even with the border crisis that we have going on today. What are the migratory patterns of these people who are coming up from South America so we can get water? I mean, just sanitary conditions to these people makes a dramatic impact. And this is available if we can just leverage location intelligence to understand migratory patterns. Behaviors of period over time, really, really important, particularly for world health. People who are hunting for water in sub-Saharan Africa and the need for that water that's going into affected malaria cases. All of those behavioral patterns as they change over time gives our organizations that we support the ability to be one step ahead of the curve so that they can get predictive on where the need is going to be needed. And disasters will strike. We know they're going to strike. And whether it's a tornado hit area in the Midwest, it's a flood in Houston, or industry Beirut crisis that we talked about, how do we impact those most affected in their communities, right? And location intelligence is critical to that, to inform our first responders, to inform where we need to put the food shelters, right? All of that can be informed, and when disaster strikes, based upon location intelligence. Mapping the standard patterns of certain areas, right? Massive disruptions on travel impacts a lot of our lives, a lot of our ability to provide these needed resources. And we saw that with COVID, right? And one of the use cases we're going to talk about is New York subway. New York without public transportation grinds to a halt, right? And if people don't feel comfortable getting on public transportation because of COVID or other things, then the city grinds to a halt. So how do we help people feel comfortable? How do we get people safe? How do we get the vaccines to the points of origin where it's needed most to make a difference to that? All of that's location intelligence. And the last thing I'll reference here is vulnerable populations, right? If we understand, like the children in the migration things, the elderly and the COVID who are most high risk, if we can understand using location intelligence, our intersections with places and the migratory patterns and the mobility analytics about these vulnerable populations, we can make better, smarter decisions about where to apply resources. And that's all built at a fundamental level about location intelligence. It's not the only sensor, again, satellite, people on the ground, and other things are really important. But when you fuse them all together with location intelligence, it becomes that much more amplified and that much more powerful. So the way we think about broad applications of location intelligence, and we have a whole area on our website, I'll show you the link later, where we're actually constantly sourcing for ability to apply location intelligence for other social good projects. We allow people to submit projects for our involvement, but certainly things like urban development and city planning. When we think about this, I used to do a lot of volunteer work at my local food shelter here. Understanding where people are coming from to that food shelter helps get to the last mile delivery, right? How do I get the resources rather than reliant upon people coming to the food shelters? Maybe there's a better way to get the resources to those in most need. If we could just understand a little bit more about the points of origin and how to get city resources, which are so finite, to those that are in most need. Public health initiatives are key. We talked about this. We all learned a lot about contact tracing around COVID-19, and contact tracing not just to understand where outbreaks started from, but where do I got to go apply resources, right? Where do I got to get nurses? Where do I got to get healthcare providers? Where, on a predictive nature based upon human mobility, is the next outbreak going to come from? And all that we call public health initiatives as an example. Obviously, disaster preparedness, we talked a lot about that, but I'll never forget having a conversation with FEMA. And FEMA was explaining to me, and I didn't have an appreciation for this at the time, but when flash floods occur in the United States, the times that they occur will significantly impact how they think about resources. Migratory patterns in Atlanta suburbs is entirely different at 4 o'clock on a Monday than 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. People are in just different places at different times. And if we understand that backward looking, we can get really precise about the impacted areas during things like flash floods. Humanitarian efforts we discussed a little bit, but it's critical, right? It is truly a world of very, very specific allocation of resources, and those that are in most need are often those that don't get the need. And if we can get smarter and leverage any bit of information and data that helps us better inform our ability to allocate resources to those that are in most need, then it's of critical nature to do it. And as we said earlier, those humanitarian needs are only increasing. Every year, we see more and more requirements for this. Scientific research is really, really big for this. If you can integrate human mobility into your scientific research, behavioral analytics, something as simple as smoking cessation programs, right? Understanding what, and from an aggregated mobility sense, what actually impacts people's ability to effectively quit smoking. It affects people's ability to effectively make better health choices that are more sustainable. That's all in the data. And if we can unlock it, then we can be smarter and more effective in the things that we do as programs to make a difference. In environmental protection, the environment is key. Those natural catastrophes, which we see getting bigger, populations are increasing. The impacts of any catastrophe has a greater effect. How is our behaviors? How is our movement patterns? How we interact with our world impacting our environmental situation? Location intelligence is a great early indicator of some of those things. So not only where to apply need when catastrophes occur, but how is our engagement with our planet and making a difference in terms of what those catastrophes are, all fundamental parts of how do we leverage location intelligence. So just a couple of quick recent case studies. So Gravy Analytics recently partnered with community data platforms in the city of Nantucket. And it was an interesting because Nantucket is an interesting city that it has migratory, all right, people. It has full-time residents. And effectively what they were trying to do was from an economic awareness sense, is just understanding what is the travel patterns, the consumptive behaviors of those that are visiting Nantucket. How do we get better understanding of weather impacts, travel needs, and really what we were able to help them do at an economic level was to get more commercial flights in and out of Nantucket from points of origin that they didn't have awareness of. But certainly a lot of other applications emerged as we were working down this. And we have this case study on our website. But seasonal migration, traveling to the powders, in an evacuation, particularly a place like Nantucket, how do we get people on and off, right? How do we understand from, again, using location intelligence in an emergency situation, how do we understand the different seasonality migration patterns to get people on and off when needed? High risk times. Obviously, as I said before in the FEMA example, depending on when an emergency strikes, depending on what time, day, month, season, all of it will have a different response plan that they need to have. Just understanding the migratory patterns of the people on and off the locations impacts those plans when they go into effect, and it's no longer guesswork. And clearly, city to citizen services. How do I get in any place, whether it's Nantucket or downtown Kansas, how do I get city services to those that are in most need, understanding those that consume those city services, points of origin, where are they coming from? Again, last mile delivery to those that are in most need when you have very constrained and confined resources. That's one. And the last one that I'll talk about, and then I'll turn it back over to the panel, was work that we did with Geospatial Alpha on New York City COVID response analysis. And at its core, this was about helping the city come back to life, right? And we understand the necessity of public transportation, not just in New York, but obviously in many places, is a necessity for the city and its vibrancy to ever return. People have to feel comfortable getting in crowded public transportation. And the way to feel comfortable is to understand points of origin, of ridership, points of destination, optimizing those railways, getting vaccines to the points of origin where it's most needed to make a difference so people feel comfortable, and getting the resources to those so that people can start to open back up, get back on public transportation, and understand how to open back up New York. But again, the use cases for that information didn't stop there. Populations at higher risk of spreading infectious diseases during the pandemic by consumer patterns is important. It becomes predictive, right? Passes prologue and viral transmissions. Understanding the intent. What are people doing, right? When they get to these places, are they business, leisure, government use? Because we can optimize travel times, optimize public transportation schedules, not just trains, but buses and others, to make sure that we understand based upon the engagement. Again, location engagement is not just mobility, but it's engagement with the places to optimize those things, and understand the highest points of traffic as it relates to, in this case, comfort on public transportation, getting testing sooner to those that most need it and are required for that comfort level is vitally important. And I would argue not just for COVID, but for any time. And yeah, COVID was 2020's nightmare, but there could be others coming. So understanding this, not just from a lessons learned in 2020 and 2021, but how do we prepare for the next one? How do we understand and instantiate this information so that we are better equipped, smarter, faster, more agile to get the help to those that are in most need going forward. So in there, again, visit gravyanalytics.com. That link on the bottom there is our social good destination. We encourage anyone that has ideas, projects, ways to help us get engaged. We're continuously looking to do that. We have several ongoing projects today. But together, and what, again, wasn't available 10 years ago, but is today, we can and are making a difference. I'll stop there.
Great, Jeff. Thanks for a very interesting presentation illustrating the power of location data. Really appreciate it. For the audience, in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you should be able to find a Q&A tab. You might have to poke around a little bit. For example, if you have the list of attendees open, you'll need to close that. If you have questions for Jeff or the panel, please enter them into the Q&A tab. We'll be monitoring that for your questions. And now I'd like to introduce our great panel. I'm really grateful for their attendance here. I'm pleased to introduce Julie Kay. Julie is the Vice President of Sustainability and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as the Executive Director of Click.org at Click. She leads Click's Office of Sustainability, which works to combat climate change, as well as advance the company's diversity and equity initiatives. She brings a collaborative focus to environmental programs and the inclusion and well-being of people everywhere. Welcome, Julie. Thanks for joining us. Patrick O'Neill is the Chief Data Scientist at BlackSky. As an intern, Patrick developed the core algorithms that form the foundation of Spectra AI, the company's AI machine learning powered predictive geospatial analytics platform. When the global pandemic hit, Patrick and his team built a system to monitor social mixing from space, integrate the observations into the latest epidemiology models, and provide critical risk assessments to the U.S. Air Force. So we'll hear from Patrick, I think, about location data from space, monitored from space. Our last panelist is Dr. Barbara Hoops. She's the Academic Director of Virginia Tech's MBA programs and Associate Professor of Business Information Technology. Barbara teaches in the areas of operations and supply chain management, business intelligence and analytics, and study abroad. Her research interests are in the area of performance measurement and evaluation using mathematical modeling approaches. Barbara, panel's all yours.
All right. Welcome, everyone. As Jeff started out, if you can't hear or see me, please do let me know, but it seems like everything's working at the moment. So I'm thrilled to be here this afternoon with such accomplished panelists, and I'd like to hear from each of them as an initial response to Jeff's talk. So Julie, I know that Click has been doing some things also in the disaster response area. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, Dr. Hoops. Click is a technology company based just outside of Philadelphia in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. And our technology is designed to help organizations leverage data of any type, shape, or size to reach a mission or reach a goal, if you will. And for the past 10 years, I've had the privilege of heading up our philanthropic work, where we donate our software to about 400 global nonprofits, including organizations like the United Nations, C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, as well as the WHO. And what we found, and Jeff's remarks resonated with me greatly, was that, location analytics really is key and to a organization working to serve populations in various areas, really kind of vulnerable to various conditions, so that they can reach those individuals faster, with more resources, and prioritize the support that they're giving to truly save more lives. We've had a lot of work going on during the pandemic in support of these same partners. One organization that we work with is Direct Relief, out of Santa Barbara, California. And direct relief is really, think of them as the humanitarian supply chain. So pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson, AbbVie, Pfizer, and hundreds of others donate their products to direct relief. And it's direct relief then that combines products from multiple vendors and ships them out to areas of need, whether they're responding to a natural disaster like an earthquake, to a humanitarian need such as Ebola, the Ebola crisis a few years ago, which earned direct relief actually an award for their work, to most recently the COVID-19 pandemic. And what direct relief does is understands kind of what is happening in various areas of, every state, every county within the United States, as well as 100 other countries around the world. And without a location analysis, they wouldn't be able to determine what products are needed in what area to serve what people, right? So they load all of this cargo onto FedEx planes. FedEx donates planes actually to ship these products around the world. But without knowing kind of where the need is the greatest and where these communities reside, where the people reside that are suffering from these various disasters, direct relief wouldn't know what products to ship where. So it becomes very basic, very crucial to how they operate their business. And it sounds very, it sounds like it could be complex. Now, don't get me wrong, what direct relief does is very, very complex. But adding in that geospatial component into this data analysis environment that direct relief leverages is actually very straightforward. But the payoff for that is immeasurable.
Thank you, Julie. That's really interesting. And I know Click is such a powerful platform to be able to integrate not only the analytics portion, but also the location data that can be made available in situations such as this. Patrick, do you want to give us a few words about your work and its connection to location intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me to speak on the panel today. So Black Sky is a global monitoring company. Our mission really is to be able to monitor the world and offer a responsive monitoring capability that has global reach and is persistent in the sense that we don't get an update on what's going on and then move on to the next problem set. We can really persistently understand activity at a location. And the way that we accomplish that is through our constellation of imaging satellites. So we currently operate a constellation of imaging satellites, a growing constellation, and we're launching additional satellites in order to increase what we call our revisit rate around the world, which is basically how often we can image anywhere on Earth. And because of the global coverage of satellites, it really allows us to reach in and provide information to just about any user around the world that may need it and is interested in using satellite-based services. So when it comes to using this data for the social good, there are really innumerable use cases that you can explore with this type of data. Certainly disaster response is one of the most immediately important. And if we kind of think through how satellite imagery can help in a disaster, an example that you can turn to is the port explosion in Beirut, which was not a natural disaster, but a disaster nonetheless. And what's really interesting there is when you start looking at how do you respond to something like that in a way that can quickly help first responders. So Black Sky approaches satellite imagery a bit different from a lot of others. We really take it from a activity monitoring approach. And so we have a system that's always monitoring the globe for activity. And when it spots something anomalous, like a port explosion that actually registers on the Richter scale, our system will actually automatically flag that and then can collect satellite imagery of that activity. So it's recognized as a disaster, as an explosion. Our satellites are automatically tasked for collection. And then our AI backend called Spectra AI is actually capable of doing a before and after assessment over that port to identify damaged buildings and identify roads and things like that, which can help immediately to aid first responders in figuring out exactly where the damage has occurred, When you mix that with other data sets like the mobile geolocation data sets, you can start to see, you can correlate damaged locations with how many people may have been at those locations and really start deploying resources effectively. And all of this needs to occur in an extremely tight loop so that you get that information and you can update that information and you can get that information out to first responders rapidly. So Black Sky really focuses on tightening that loop as much as possible so that we can be extremely responsive and even anticipatory, do that collection, have AI processing in the loop in order to rapidly build these analytic products and then get them out to our customers and the first responders as quickly as possible.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions showing up in the Q&A, and I'd like to encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature as if you have any questions about what we're talking about here. Jeff, the question came up as to the emergence of 5G and whether that will make more or better data available for the work that you do.
The short answer is yes, and it's sort of on an emerging and evolutionary track here with 5G. But yeah, it will make the data transference, its fidelity, and other data attributes way more widely available. And then pairing with some of the other panelists' capabilities, very, very powerful.
And the other question from the same gentleman, Richard from Neosystems, he's asking about if disabling location tracking on phones for privacy doesn't mess with your data a little bit.
Yeah, don't do that. No, I'm kidding. At its core, we're an analytic company. We don't require a lot of data to create powerful intelligence. It will always be a sampling. And so our job as a company is to see as much data as we can, as many different ways, so as many different times throughout the day, but to drive some of the use cases and the intelligence that we discussed earlier. It really doesn't take but a little bit of a sampling to make the dramatic impacts that we discussed. Mm-hmm. So while we rely upon it, it doesn't take a lot of information.
Because of the predictive nature of some of the modeling that you're using.
Well, and you think about it, I mean, everybody always can relate to Nielsen at one time. I mean, Nielsen commands billions of dollars of ad spend on a less than 2% sample size. Yeah, it doesn't take a lot of information to create powerful analytics.
Thanks. Nandini from Analytics and Insights asks, partnering with many app creators is important to maintain a large amount of data and representation for the clients, depending on the customers or the people that are being studied. How do you maintain consistency and representation of a sample?
Yeah, I assume that's for me. It's another great question. So we will see data from over 100,000 apps on any given month, right? And as we aggregate, 40 billion transactions a day, the proliferation of that comes from having a lot of different apps, a lot of different use cases, a lot of different geographies, diversity of both OS, app usage, all of these things to create what is a biggest quote unquote panels we possibly can. And to give you a sense of scale, it's obviously globally billions, but in the US, it's roughly 150, 170 million unique devices that we will see on any given month. So it gives us tremendous ability to wield that analytic scale that I talked about earlier, just from that proliferation of vast amounts of data.
Michael's revisiting the topic of data quality, and I'm sure this affects the work that all of you do. And how do you assess data quality, since some of the use cases, it's incredibly important for that in these life and death kinds of situations? Julie, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Yes, we address data quality in a kind of a variety of different ways. First and foremost, kind of the technology that we design is actually kind of capable of bringing in all data that you have, the good, bad, and the ugly. And we'll represent all of that data back to you in the various analytics and or reports that you create based on that data. And so it's important that you not shield kind of your organization from the bad data or the inaccurate data, but recognize it and create processes to obviously prevent that in the future, whether it be from survey data, from your source systems that are collecting that data, to really any way in which that data is coming into your analytical environment. You want to see it all, right? The good, bad, and the ugly, not just the good, but all of it, so you can properly identify ways in which you can collect even better data. It might be something just as simple as, you work with some organizations that are new in their data analytics journey, and they might send out surveys to their beneficiaries that include a lot of open text fields. You can't do a lot of analytics with open text, right? It might come in different languages. It might, you can't really kind of aggregate that and really use it to make decisions about how you might prioritize a given distribution of benefits. So one simple way of collecting better data, quite honestly, is changing from collecting information via open text fields to now actually looking for specific scores, or rank this item actually on a 1 to 5 scale, so that you start to get data back to your organization that is actually useful. And then the second kind of, I guess, comment that I make to the question there is that, a lot of folks tend to kind of hold back from going through with these projects, going through with these data analytic projects, because they feel they don't have perfect data. And what we try to coach our partners through is that we recognize no one has perfect data. Even the largest banks in the world don't sometimes have perfect data, right? But there's still value in, let's say, the 80% that is good. There is still value in the data that you do have, that you can properly identify kind of opportunities for better decisions, better prioritizations, as well as kind of working with even other partners to understand how you might all be working to kind of answer to a crisis. So I guess in summary, one, there are ways, and actually quite simple ways, to clean up the bad data. And then, but understanding it and creating new processes is important. And then the second is, don't be afraid of moving forward with a project. If you know you have bad data, there's still value in the good data percentage that you have.
Thanks, Julie. Patrick, data quality?
Yeah, this is something that we have to think about quite a bit, as I'm sure most data-based companies have to think about. We operate a few different data products, and each of them have their own unique ways of dealing with data quality. I mentioned that event system up front that's tracking activity around the world. For that, we look at reporting, like news reporting and other data sources that might corroborate what we're seeing, to identify like where specifically did this activity happen, what specifically happened, who was involved. When we're talking about satellite imagery, data quality is a whole other animal. If there's a cloud sitting right on top of the area you're interested in, then an image may not help you that much. But you can look at some other data sources. Black Sky offers the ability to collect synthetic aperture radar imagery as well, which has cloud penetration capabilities. And so maybe you may need another type of data in order to help solve the problem. And then when it comes to analyzing the data, there's also quality issues that can come up there as well. So how reliable are the analytics that you're running? This is where uncertainty quantification becomes incredibly important. We don't want to tell somebody that there is something going on. We want to say we believe there's something going on with this level of confidence and this level of uncertainty. And then ultimately, we can deal with this problem through transparency as well. So we provide satellite images. People can look at those images and make the assessment for themselves. They can double check, they can cross check. And so we really try and deal with data quality on a data set by data set basis, but also have multiple levels that ensure quality assurance. And then ultimately, through transparency, we don't hide the way that we came to a decision. We make that logic very well known to the customer.
Thanks. Jeff, any more comments about data quality and these sort of life and death situations and how Gravy handles this?
By the way, I love some of the answers you just received. I think transparency is really,
Yeah.
really important. And I always tell everybody in the data world, the question isn't whether you have bad data. You do. The question is knowing the difference. In fact, a lot of our patents and IP work has been just around the things that some of that was just discussed. We never ever take a black box approach to data quality. It's always transparent. We have a whole platform called Forensics, which not only describes every bit of data that in our organization and in what we deliver, but its source of derivation, its trustworthiness, its authenticity, and how it's authenticated. Because even bad data can be good information if you understand the difference and how to process it.
Thanks. Chris Sobel from Virginia Tech, he's a colleague of mine in the Business Information Technology Department. He does some work in the disaster relief area in his research. And he asks, in the context of disaster relief and evacuation, what kind of data is available to identify the, quote, vulnerable individuals or populations so that they can be targeted?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously of the utmost importance, especially, kind of living through the past, year of the pandemic. So there's public data sets, right, on population, and that can be, both at the country level as well as sub-regional level. That's accessible. Some of those data sets are not exactly perfect, that's for certain. But one example that we've been working on recently, actually for the past 12 months, is this partnership that we have with the Asian Development Bank. They're one of the largest development banks, kind of a sister bank, if you will, to the World Bank, in their COVID response. And the first application that we designed in partnership with them was to look at the countries within their region and pulling from kind of various public data sets, obviously the cases and mortality rates for the countries that actually Asian Development Bank is responsible in supporting. And then we pulled in population data, subnational data for all of their countries. That was another public data set. And then they used that information to run models as they were negotiating aid packages for the various countries in response to the pandemic. Right? So even a country that might not have a lot of cases per se, their industry of tourism was completely wiped out. No one could travel to their country. So their economy and the loss of GDP growth was enormous. So by pulling these different pieces together, and population, and locations of populations were very key to the success of this application and use of this application, organizations that are making big decisions can make more informed decisions, right? You still have humans at the point of making those decisions, but they're much more informed of how to make those decisions. Just in the past month, we've been able to add vaccination data into that application. And so we're using that to support ADB's efforts to track the vaccinations rates within their 48 member countries, along with cases and mortality rates, so that, again, they can make decisions on where to get those vaccines that come into their countries the fastest. So population data is very important, and understanding that and providing tools and how to leverage it, marrying that with location data is, something that, we're really keen on exploring with all of our partners.
Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of data that you use to identify vulnerable individuals and populations?
Absolutely. I think if you think about how we navigate the world, our engagement with places creates a fingerprint on both the place and us. Over time, those become indelible, right? I am a yoga enthusiast if I go to a yoga studio 3 times a week, right? I'm a NFL fan or Virginia Tech football fan if I go to Lane Stadium, 5 times a year. So those indelible fingerprints on one another creates an impression of who people are that are at those places. And in sub-Saharan Africa, if I understand at a geospatial and temporal way, schools, for example, then I understand population engagement with that are probably largely children and or those teachers, right? And if I have a malaria outbreak that largely affects children, I can use that indelible impression of engagement with a place and associated people to inform my decision around who those most at-risk populations might be.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the use of the information that we've been talking about. The decision makers are not always maybe the most technologically savvy, and there needs to be visualizations, analytics translators in the mix, people that can do that bridging from the modeling and the technology and the analytics to the people who are making the decisions. I'm wondering if any of you have just some insights into the importance of that role. Patrick?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer that one. So this is a really important point, actually. Traditionally, dealing with geospatial data has not been all that easy, which is interesting because at this point, I think everybody uses a map like once a day at least, probably more than once a day. And certainly pre-pandemic, people were using maps kind of all the time with GPS on their phones. So the majority of the population is map literate, but being able to use geospatial tools is still incredibly challenging for a lot of people. And in my world of satellite imagery, being able to log into a website and through an Amazon style checkout order a satellite image like you can do with BlackSky is just completely unheard of. So in the past, there are still times that we have to send faxes to order images from some other vendors. So being able to be conversant with geospatial data is one thing. Being able to access geospatial data is another thing. And then being able to visualize geospatial data is oftentimes equally challenging, if not more challenging. Typically, you're going to have different levels of fidelity for geospatial data. You'll have different levels of precision. Some things like mobility data can be very precise, like specific coordinates, or it might be aggregated up. You could have information at zip code level or regional level or national level. And how do you visualize the different levels of aggregation that are occurring across different data sets? When you add in a time component to things, it can get really quite complicated. So as an example, at BlackSky, we are focused on taking what we call image stacks. So these are many images a day over a location, and then running analytics like time series analysis and understanding how activity has changed over time. Well, now you're asking people to think along quite a few different dimensions here. You're asking them to think about each individual image, but then also there's this time component, and you can go through time and things change throughout the day. So being able to visualize that can be quite challenging. And one way that we've found works is just through like a simple time series where you can click through and each image will come up when you look at it. But then if you want to overlay different data sets, it can be quite complicated. So we've spent a lot of time and resources and effort building a very easy interface to this data. And I think that that's really critical, especially, Jeff's talking about 1 billion signals a day. Humans aren't really trained to look through that kind of data. So you need to be able to bring things to the forefront, tell people what to look at, and give them easy ways of digesting that data.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Patrick in that, we need to, well, part of it might be just a lot of terms that we use within the data kind of technology industry, right? We use these terms like machine learning and AI and all of that. And I had the pleasure of working with some students, and they presented this very kind of sophisticated machine learning algorithm as a solution for the UN SDGs. And actually, if you kind of just looked below the covers a little bit, it was really just a spreadsheet. So, sometimes we get caught up in all of this terminology and fancy lingo and all of that. And that scares off a lot of people from kind of being, wanting to advance their skills and understanding data to make better decisions. A couple of years ago, we launched with several partners with Accenture, Pluralsight, as many others, this initiative called the Data Literacy Project. And it's a nonprofit endeavor. So at dataliteracyproject.org, what all of these organizations that have partnered together are providing are a series of curriculums to make everyone more data aware. And we use data every day. Like Patrick said, we use it a map on our phone, right? We understand how many children our neighbor has. You know, that's data processing right there. Might not be the data processing that, you know, nerds like myself think about every day, but it really actually is a fundamental capability for everyone within an organization now, not just a data science department, but everyone within an organization has really kind of the ability to leverage data to perform better in their jobs for their company. And so, you know, those kinds of curriculums like Data Literacy Project are really important for taking kind of demystifying this black art science and making it real for, you know, for everyone within an organization.
Jeff, analytics translation, visualization, how important is that to the work you do?
You're talking to somebody who can't set the clock on their microwave. So Julie and Patrick have this covered in spades. But I will say this: I think typically we're not talking about data; we're talking about intelligence. The portability and the usefulness of that is what turns data to intelligence, and usually the democratization of tools and ability for people to access trails the core kernel of capability. So what Julie and Patrick said, I mean, they're by far the experts in this, but it's becoming refreshing every day to see how that democratization is occurring and the use cases become more and more pervasive.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've been reading recently about is citizen data science. This is kind of a term that's being used for this democratization, right, for the access of this kind of information available to decision makers at all levels within an organization. It's no longer that you have to funnel your questions through the data science department in order to get answers out. Everyone has access to powerful tools. And Sydney from Click asks, making the data available is one thing, but how do you help analysts or the average citizen data scientist, right, understand how to use that data to make decisions? Any comments?
Yeah, so I mean, Sydney, great follow-up question. I mean, that would be kind of the intent, if you will, of that data literacy project curriculum, right? Is kind of demystifying, if you will, the use of data and democratizing it across an organization. And because, you know, Sydney knows this, you can publish data and reports and dashboards and that all you want. But until they're useful and people understand kind of how to make use of those pieces of information that are coming, you know, available to them, it's just a nice, pretty picture, right? A nice, pretty dashboard. But so you want to really take a holistic approach to not only releasing the data to, you know, members within the organization, but also making sure that it's wrapped inside the proper training of how, you know, this data can be consumed and leveraged for making decisions.
Yeah, I think that there's also a bit of meat in the middle on this as well. Some geospatial data is quite complicated to work with, and because of that, it means that you need experts who know how to work with this particular type of data. But if they're experts on how to work with that type of data, they may not be experts in how you might want to apply that data or how you may want to use that data. So part of the job of companies like ours is to meet in the middle on how people want to use the data. We want to enable our data to be consumed by non-experts, and sometimes that means that we need to do some things to our images, or sometimes that means our AI system needs to be able to extract things from our images and just give that extraction to those users. So, as an example, we have the ability to detect aircraft in our images and other types of objects in our images. Well, if to do that requires us to create all these sophisticated AI models, we don't want to have to require our customers to do that themselves. So we can create some some AI-based things that then we can use across multiple customers and just give the customers the analytics that came from that. And now we've propelled them down that value chain so that they can focus on the domain expertise and adding their area of expertise to the problem set without requiring them to figure out all of the other difficult geospatial processing. So it's certainly important for people to understand the data that they're working with, but I think it's also important to make sure that you're providing data that is kind of readily useful to a broad group of people.
Mm-hmm.
So Jay from the audience congratulates you, Jeff, on your success, but he says, with great power comes great responsibility. And so given the clients whose decisions are supported with these insights, to what extent does GA, the analytics here, provide measures to counter its misses? So its false negatives, let's say, where the positive event is fraud or something that is a negative type of event. So especially if you're moving towards use cases where these insights drive fully autonomous control systems. So if you were to set a system out there that is making decisions in an autonomous sense, how do you balance this idea of the false negatives, false positives that might skew the decisions that are being made?
That's funny, great power. My kids would tell me exact opposite. That's an interesting question. So I think when we're dealing in a world of 40 billion transactions a day, half of which we know are in some shape or form unusable, right? So you already are starting from a problem set that's very difficult for anything other than algorithmically determining good from bad, truth from fiction, usable from unusable, and giving an analyst the ability to lay eyes on the prize in a very quick way as they possibly can, right? Patrick was talking about expertise. Somebody told me once, an expert is somebody who knows more and more about less and less. So I think the ability to create portability to this information, the ability to create confidence intervals, the ability for, in our world, it's APIs, to tap into our forensic algorithms to help determine what is usable versus unusable, precise versus coarse grain, aggregated versus singularities, because all of them are appropriate for use cases depending on the data sets that are available. But again, this goes back to the bad data versus good. Understanding the differences are the key. And we think about in the world, we call it forensics, which is every single bit of information we delivered has a forensic flag tied to it that speaks to its authenticity, its source of derivation, and its appropriateness for whatever associated use cases there are. And when we're dealing with that voluminous type of information, you have to have that level of fidelity on it.
Having said that, though, no model is 100%, right? I mean, we know that in, medical tests, and it would be really nice if our model got 100% on the true positives, true negatives, right, on that scale, but they're not. And so mitigating the risks associated with where our model misses, because the real situation is very different from training data, for example. This is going to be a real issue. And Jay cites the ever-changing mobile fraud landscape. And I think, when you're relying on mobile devices for the core data that you're using to make these decisions, I think spoofing mobile devices is not something that is insignificant in this arena.
In fact, that's one of the biggest forensic flags we have is called spoofing, right? And our ability to cooperate, and we use the massive scale to do that cooperation against a device that's actually, in some cases, spoofing means different things. It could be actual fraudulent behavior, it could be sloppy programming, it could be intermittent connectivity with a GPS satellite or other things that could cause what would look like a spoofed signal. But identifying that using various cooperative techniques and a bunch of machine learning to identify and flag it is helpful. And by the way, to some analysts in our worlds, a device that's spoofing its location is really actionable intelligence. right? But to know the difference is the trick. And yes, nothing is 100%, but we've spent a lot of time and a lot of our technology is to identify those various degrees of differences.
Julie, Patrick? Move on.
I think Jeff
That's fine. Yeah, I just want to give everybody an opportunity. So Nandini comes with another question. Do you think to get more robust and clean data, it would be worthwhile to pay users in some way, like via an app, for example, for data like mail and online panels? Additionally, data privacy ransomware may compel users to not share their information. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. By the way, I don't think. I mean, when we're talking about location intelligence, and Patrick and Julie really spoke to a lot of this, it's fusing together a variety of sensor data, right? A variety of data sets together to create actionable intelligence. User activated data, panels, paying people to use apps, paying people to take surveys, paying people to go on the ground and take pictures. That's a valid signal, right? Doesn't have the broad scale that you might want to apply to global patterns, but it's a very appropriate use.
Jeff, you had talked in your introductory remarks about the fact that the things that are done for privacy include pseudonymizing, aggregating, not real time. Now, some of these disasters, of course, are very time-based events. So could you talk a little bit about how time lags enter into the decision-making that's going on in some of these disaster recovery events?
No, yeah, it's a great point. And time lag in our world is usually 24 hours. And a lot of this is processing time, aggregation, fusing together, and then deploying into various platforms. But you use the FEMA example that I gave earlier, and again, it was surprising to me. But if you really think about it, past is prologue. Where people are at 2 o'clock on a Sunday is different than where they are at 4 o'clock on a Monday. And over time, reliability gets built into those models. And so knowing exactly on this particular Sunday is probably not going to be that much different unless there's something anomalous going on than where it was last Sunday, where it was last Sunday, where it was last Sunday. So if we believe that past is prologue, building up predictive models based upon consistent observation and behaviors gives us the intelligence to act in what would be a real-time, disaster situation. That is not to say, and where Patrick and Julie and really come in, is aiding the first responders in a real time sensitive way. There's a lot of tools and apparatuses and data for that. We're really about forensically understanding this so you can create predictive models and understand if that tsunami hits in Bali at 3 o'clock next Thursday, what are the mobility patterns that are likely to be at that time.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to think of this as like a responsiveness, anticipatory, predictive. There's different ways of being prepared or responding to a disaster or crisis event, and certainly being able to take a satellite image really quickly is helpful, and it's helpful in a couple ways, but bringing together multiple data sources is where you really unlock the most value. So understanding where people typically are and then using the satellite image to determine if there is damage to those areas or if there's an easy evacuation route is really important. And then when you're talking about vulnerable groups, overlaying that kind of data on top of the damage maps that you're able to generate, being able to bring these different data sets together and fuse them into a cohesive product is really where you get the most value. And it also helps with issues that you might encounter from spoofing or deception or things being obscured, because you're bringing together multiple data sets. So when they agree with each other, you can be more confident in that data. And that's something that really comes into kind of the uncertainty modeling that you're doing. And all of that needs to be done in basically real time in order to rapidly respond to a crisis event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we worked with a nonprofit called MedAir out of Lausanne, Switzerland, and they work in some of the most vulnerable areas of the world, and some of the most vulnerable people in need. And their work in, kind of seems simple now, but a few years ago, in response to the Syrian refugee crisis, Rain Hanna, who is their country director in Lebanon, recognized that they were responding to the refugee crisis. And MedAir would ship shelter tents, wash systems, medical support, maternal health kits, things like that, to help, individuals fleeing with the crisis. And one thing that she clued in on was that, and she's being from Lebanon, she knew that there was a very great difficulty in identifying addresses for the informal settlements that were being established. And so just kind of an idea that she had was to create what she called a P code, which was an address point with a latitude and longitude that she recorded in a spreadsheet for these different informal settlements that were being, kind of sprung up all over the country. And she registered these P codes into this Excel spreadsheet with latitude and longitude coordinate points, loaded that into an application, and began sharing that application not only with her team at MedAir, but with all NGOs working in the region. Because what was happening is all these NGOs were kind of rushing in to help people, but there was no way to prioritize and identify which NGO was servicing which area of the country. They were all stepping all over each other, thus ineffective, not being as effective as they could be, right? If they kind of divided and kind of identified the areas in which they'd work, and thus kind of could prioritize their mission towards one area, and another NGO could work in another area. So just with this simple idea of creating these P codes, putting this in an application, making this accessible not just to her nonprofit, but to all of the NGOs, it was game-changing in the amount of people that they were able to support. So, what Patrick and Jeff are talking about, a very sophisticated geospatial analysis and data, which is needed for, decision-making and, and the challenges that we face, such as the pandemic and climate change and all of that. But, there's also simple kind of examples of the use of location data for real world scenarios as well. And I guess the message in that would be, you don't have to wait for the perfect data. Don't have to wait for kind of the perfect set of information to come to you. But, Rain's examples, she went out and created it, and it ended up helping, all of the beneficiaries that these NGOs were serving.
Tom asks a question regarding the sources of data. So he says, assuming it's apps that people use that are the sources of location data, what are the types of apps that are providing data, and how does that affect which use cases you can respond to?
Sure. Good question, Tom. I think our world, our mission in life, we have a whole organization that optimizes what we call supply side. Is to see as many different devices from as many different modalities and apps as we can throughout the day. To get 100,000 apps in any given month means we're seeing a vast cross-sectional use case from a variety of categorical apps to help support that mission. And we do. And we try to make sure that we're constantly optimizing it, not just for the apps themselves and the category of apps themselves, but also the geographies, right? The language packs, the types of places that we can get this information. And it largely follows smartphone proliferation throughout the world, with a couple of geographies that are harder than others. But generally, where smartphone proliferation exists, apps exist, and where apps exist, location data exists, and then we can fuse that together into intelligence.
Right, so Jay's back talking about performance measures again for models, and he leaves a link there in the Q&A that links to a page on the Gravy Analytics site called Tracking Fraudulent Mobile Devices with Forensic Flags. So apparently this is some work that you've done and talked about on your website. So he is interested in the insights regarding precision, recall, sensitivity, specificity, all of that, and how often this kind of tracking or forensic flagging would flag legitimate Android user data in a global sensor implementation via edge container orchestration.
Yeah, and again, people have different connotations with the word fraudulent. When I say that half of the data that exists in this ecosystem is in some way, shape, or another flawed, in many cases it is fraudulent, but also in many cases it could just be problematic data. And that's the reason I gave the example earlier of trying to get an Uber in New York City, and the skylines play havoc with GPS signals, right? Indoors, outdoors, VPN, non-VPN, a cellular triangulation data that has a specificity of a city block is useful for some use cases, but it isn't specifically granular or accurate enough for first responder use cases, for attribution or measurement. And so understanding those differences are what forensics are all about. Believe it or not, there is a lot of fraud that exists in this ecosystem because there are bad actors who are doing nefarious things. Human trafficking as an example, right? We talk about everything and battling on defensive measure, but human traffickers are a huge problem that exists in this world, and they are constantly spoofing their locations, trying to hide their locations, because they're smuggling human beings, right, across various territories. So that data is really powerful. Understanding it, flagging it, and providing it to analysts for their various use cases is where we focus. And that's all called forensics, which I guess there's a link up for it.
I was introduced recently for a completely different reason to an app called What 3 Words. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically it's mapped the entire surface of the Earth using 3 unique words. So because many places, and especially the areas where maybe you're talking about with refugees, with a flooding in some of third world countries, they don't have street addresses, right? You can't send the emergency vehicle or the boat to a particular address. How do you handle that problem of not having precise locations, or having to create a precise location for areas on the Earth that may not have an address that we're used to using here in our first world environment?
Well, and Julie and Patrick probably have their own approach to this. We actually divide the Earth up into tiles. We call them geohashes. And for example, geohash 5, it's roughly 8 or 7 or 8 is roughly a 5 by 5 meter tile, which is how we think about the world. And in other cases, we're building object models and understand commercial places of interest. But at its core and at its granular level is a world called a geohash. And that geohash has metadata about it that defines its geohash. When I talked about the indelible fingerprints that a object has on a person and a person on the object, those are granularly defined in our world as geohashes.
Yeah, I think that this is an important point as well, and it ties back to the kind of vulnerable groups discussion. There are a lot of people in the world who live places that don't have an address. There's a lot of people who live places that aren't mapped at all. And what we would maybe even typically think of as the middle of nowhere. But in reality, those people have the same needs as everybody else. And so if you're in a location that's not part of a map like Google Maps or OpenStreetMaps or any number of mapping services, then you may have needs, and people may need, first responders may need to be able to get to you, or humanitarian aid may need to be able to get to you. And that's one area where satellite imagery can certainly help, but also having AI-based solutions that can scan for man-made structures in large areas and identify roads and build out a map just from pixels is extremely valuable in those circumstances. Instead of having to so it's important to remember that like creating one map is very time intensive, right? If you grab a bunch of satellite images and you go through and you draw lines over all of the roads, that takes a long time. But the world is not static. The world is dynamic. There's constantly new buildings being constructed. There's new roads. Maybe one area that was previously accessible, the bridge has collapsed, or there's been flooding along one of the roads or deterioration in a road condition. And so creating maps on its own is very difficult, but then keeping maps updated is as difficult as creating the map initially often. So when you bring in large scale imaging solutions and you combine that with artificial intelligence, you can combine it with mobile or mobility data to understand that, hey, we see a lot of pretty quick movement along this corridor, but there's no road in this base map. Maybe there is actually a road there and we just don't know about it. Let's take an image of it and see if there's a road. That can really help start to solve this challenging problem. And for there to be an address, there needs to be an addressing system. And many places don't even have an addressing system. So it would be impossible to even provide an address. We use things like geohashes, but also because we can see exactly where on Earth we're talking about, we can provide specific coordinates as well. So we can give the lat long of, hey, here's this unmapped village that's been hit by flooding, for example. From an image, you can pull out the lat long of that location, and then you can also look at where are there roads, where are there entryways, and how would flooding impact the ability to reach these people.
All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I am an educator, of course. I'm a faculty member with Virginia Tech, and I teach in both the MBA programs, in which case when I teach about data and data literacy, I'm looking to have the students be intelligent consumers of data. And then I also teach in the online Master of Information Technology program. That's a completely online degree, and these are more technical students who are in careers that have more of a technical component to it. So from your standpoint, so Patrick, I know you're also involved with GMU and working with students there. What would you like to see students coming to the world with in terms of skill sets or competencies that would make this a more effective process when we're talking about geolocation? This is not the first thing we talk about necessarily when we, are teaching about data literacy or analytics or machine learning or any of that. We sort of, you don't get as far as the geospatial intelligence necessarily. But what kind of basic competencies and skills would you like to see students have when they're coming out of bachelor's or master's programs?
Maybe I'll start with that one. So, from my perspective, the world is becoming an increasingly connected place. I don't know if anyone would disagree with that, but it's also more dynamic. Things are changing at a faster pace, and it's important to be able to respond to that kind of change. Everything is location aware. Everything is time aware. So we're living in this connected geotemporal world. It's really important to understand how to deal with that kind of data, or at least be aware of how to interpret that kind of data. So understanding things like spoofing, understanding things like geospatial precision of what you're seeing. So how precise are these measurements is really important. If you want to work with this type of data, 40 billion signals, that's really a big data problem. That's not something you can just download the 40 billion signals data set to your hard drive and start playing around with it. So understanding how to work with programming languages and new computing technologies like cloud compute is really important to be able to work directly with the data. But there's also a whole new generation of geospatial analysis, like GIS type toolkits, where people can load up data sets in a cloud environment and slice and dice them all sorts of different ways. So just being able to understand that everything has a place, everything has a time, and things are constantly changing. How do you work with that data programmatically or via interfaces is going to become increasingly important over time.
Clearly, not only in this social good arena for disaster responses, but also in the commercial sector. I know, Jeff, your company does a number of other types of analyses that use this for everything from, foot traffic for commercial entities to, sporting events. I was looking at your website earlier. So about making data literate users that will be able to think in this way about the time and place, as Patrick talked about, of data analysis. Jeff or Julie, thoughts?
You can go, Jeff, or I'm happy to.
I was just going to say, as long as they have Virginia Tech on their diploma, they're no, please.
Yeah. So one of the favorite parts of my job actually is running an intern program every summer. And I just would encourage your students to, I'll talk about the data skills here in a second, but come forth with your passion, right? The world has a lot of challenges right now. And I get the privilege of kind of bringing on anywhere from 4 to 10 interns every summer. And the work that gets done that summer is just like game changing. Because as students, the world is the way that it is, and we have lots of challenges, whether it be, climate change and global warming, to kind of solving the areas of equity and injustice, around the world, to humanitarian and disaster relief, right? There are a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of change that's needed if we hope to reach the kind of goals of things such as the Paris Agreement and the reduction of carbon emissions to 0 by 2050, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals identified by the UN. There's a lot of change that's needed. We need a lot of new building standards. We need a lot of new architectures and designs of kind of more sustainable buildings. We need to plan where we build bridges better to serve underserved communities within some of our cities, right? So we have a lot of challenges ahead. And what we need is kind of a new way of thinking. And that's what's coming from our universities with the students and their new way of thinking and their ideas about breaking down the status quo. Let's not just rebuild the bridge where it's at. Let's think about how we could actually design it to be better and to serve more people. And so as students coming out of university, one of your best ways to actually kind of move ahead with kind of not only a commercial mission, but also a social good mission, right, is to back up your cause, back up your argument, back up your case with data. And so, I work a lot in the, kind of the climate space. One of our partners is the UNFCCC, which organizes the COP event every year, this year in Scotland, where all countries come together to negotiate the reduction of carbon emissions. And we kind of put a couple of interns last summer on some projects for the UNFCCC. And they created this incredible application that actually looked at the entire conference floor and the last one in Madrid and actually identified where people are, which sessions they were going to then measure kind of the foot traffic as well as the intent of people attending those sessions. Now that application is actually going to be used for this year's COP. And it was built by two 20-year-olds, right? And that's just really exciting. I think there's just a really exciting opportunity for young people to come forward with solutions that are needed. There's more buy-in than ever from people at the very tops of very important organizations to look at new solutions. And when you can back that up with data and intelligence and, kind of a substantive kind of information to kind of make your argument or to kind of propose a new solution, it's that much stronger. And so I guess the main piece of advice would come forth with your passion and back it up with data, and people within organizations will listen.
Jeff, skill sets that you like your people to have as they come in to work on this data, or in your clients as they use this data? Are there particular competencies that you like to see?
No, I think I could echo everybody what they suggested. I will say this. I mean, data is an abstraction. Having the ability to think logically, to interrogate things. I never forget Jimmy Connors once said that the greatest tennis player in the world is someone who will never pick up a racket, right? The greatest answers to the data are there. We just don't know how to ask the questions. And so when we think about this, the application of machine learning and emergent AI techniques to actually look at 40 billion transactions a day and see what's there, it's a little bit like a Monet. You got to step back. And in some of those cases, the most basic logical principles apply. And then you have the eureka moment.
All right. So we have another question in the Q&A that asks how mobile user tracking latency and geolocation resolution overlay with the satellite version. So planet.com is referenced with the monitoring of the of the Earth. And I think, Patrick, this gets into how your area of research and work maybe overlaps with Jeff's area, or what has been done with the mobile user tracking in the Click use cases. And so, could you talk a little bit about what sorts of use cases are appropriate for maybe something that is a little more satellite view, and which use cases maybe have a little more applicability in the mobile user tracking?
Sure, maybe I'll go. Since Planet's not here, I'll give the Black Sky answer. So I think that there's a lot of really good overlap with these types of data sets. I've mentioned a couple on the call today. So in a disaster response scenario, being able to understand where people typically are at this time of day, and correlating that with the damage that you're seeing in the satellite image. Being able to understand where there are new transportation patterns or traffic and mobility patterns is also quite interesting. We've done some work for the Air Force that's actually looking at, and I think this was mentioned in my bio, at imaging over populated areas, so cities, suburbs, things like that, and looking at how full parking lots are at department stores and other kind of congregation points throughout the pandemic, and then using that, correlating that with mobility data to understand, when I see a parking lot that's 80% full, how many people do I expect to see at that location, so that we can get a sense on social mixing. But very early in the pandemic, people started using social mixing in their epidemiology models, but they were often collected through simulation. It wasn't actually direct observation of social mixing. And we have this ability to collect around the world and run these AI models to understand how many people are actually at all these locations, and then correlate that with mobile data and insert them into these epidemiology models instead of pure simulation in order to understand. So what's nice about satellites is you get a very broad view of what's going on. You can take the picture multiple times a day, and you can run AI and other things to extract value from it. But what's nice about mobility data is that it can be very precise. It can be very localized. You also can get like a nighttime activity, which is hard to collect with optical satellite imagery. So there's a lot of ways that they actually work really well together in a very harmonious loop.
Jeff or Julie, from your perspective, the difference between the use cases that take advantage of one technology or another particularly well, or overlaps, as Patrick was talking about?
I will say this. I mean, Patrick's right. They are very harmonious and very synergistic. one of the things that we focus a lot on is also relevance to the engagement, the why, not just where. In the U.S., you might come to mind, like if I'm at the Verizon Center in Washington D.C., was it Disney on Ice or was it the Jay-Z concert, right? The why and who is entirely different based upon the contextual relevance of that, and it's got a temporal analysis, but I think they're very, very synergistic.
Yeah, relevance is key, like Jeff said, and Patrick. There is a thing as too much data, and we work with a lot of nonprofits that are, kind of all about collecting data and in kind of helping them along their data journey. Oftentimes, we actually eliminate many of their data collection processes because they're just they're unwieldy, they're not leading to results, and they're just collecting data and spending all their time collecting data rather than collecting key pieces of information, the relevant information that they need to make decisions. So there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of great technologies out there. There are a lot of incredible use cases for data. But make sure that, obviously there's a why to it, right? There's a need for it, and not waste time collecting data just for the sake of collecting data.
So when I was a young mom, I had a calendar that hung on the wall. It was a Sandra Boynton mom calendar, and it had as its tagline, "Who goes where and does what, but not why." So it was basically a whole grid full of all these people in your family and every hour of the day and who was where doing what, but the why was really the question. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out here is with the analytics, then we're trying to overlay that layer of why these things are happening or have happened, and how we can respond to that in some way. As we bring this afternoon's session to a close, I wanted to give each of the panelists an opportunity to give us a few closing words on what we've covered here today, generally using data for social good, maybe some things that are in the future that you're looking forward to, whether it's technology emerging or evolving, or whether it's additional use cases that you might see. So I'm going to give everybody an opportunity. Julie, do you want to go first for us?
Yeah, certainly. So thank you for inviting us to the session. I've learned a lot, and I'm anxiously awaiting a time when I can, after this call, to actually go and look at Jeff and Patrick's information actually in more detail than I already have. But in any event, so, I think that it's a very exciting time, not only for kind of data and some of the technologies and use cases that we've talked about here today, but also just the understanding and potential of where we can take it in the future, right? The tools are there. We have the tools that we need to solve the world's greatest challenges. It's the implementation of those tools that's needed. So data is going to play a key role in that. Obviously, location data about how we prioritize and where we prioritize our vulnerable populations and supporting their needs is tantamount. But I think it's a very exciting time, and there's a lot of change that's going to be happening. And the more that we can embrace intelligence around data and the use of these tools and technologies, all the way from the simple spreadsheet model that I mentioned to capture addresses in Lebanon, all the way to like some of the technologies that Jeff and Patrick were talking about, and everything in between, right? There's opportunities for all of it. And, as we come together and kind of start to rebuild after the pandemic, I think it's a really exciting time to leverage all of these things to really build the world that we want. Patrick,
A few closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'd also like to thank everyone for attending and the invitation to speak here today. I definitely think we're at the beginning of a pretty massive global shift towards always-on connectivity at sort of the IoT level. There's this concept of digital twin where you have a digital version of the real world effectively, and it's powered by sensors that are everywhere. So if you're looking at modern port operations, connecting every container, understanding what is going on at a digital level across the entire port. This is going on with cities around the world as well, where you have emissions sensors across the world or across the city, all hooked into a common database. And so from like an ESG perspective, this is also just taking off now. But we're going to be in a world pretty soon where we're just awash with geospatial data. We already are, but we're going to have data from all sorts of different IoT sensors flowing in. There's tremendous opportunity to really be involved with that and to grow as that grows. This global monitoring capability is just going to get more and more powerful, and it's going to require people who really understand how to deal with large geospatial data feeds that are coming in with millions or billions of pings a day or even down to the second. So how you deal with that data, how you build scalable systems to understand that data. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, being able to take a step back from that data and understand what do we really want to accomplish with this data, as Julie mentioned, that you really need to have a system that is objectives based, is mission focused. We're collecting methane emission data to solve problem X. And you need smart people who can go from raw data to enriched data to ultimately the insights and answers that the system was built for.
Jeff, I'll give you the last word here. Thank you so much for being our keynote today and being the reason that we all had to get together. And I want to thank the panelists for their time. And I also want to thank those who joined us in the audience for giving us some of your time this afternoon. So Jeff, few closing thoughts?
No,
Data for social good, whatever you want to talk about.
I'll be brief, but thank you again for the opportunity. And I think the panelists here speaks to the quality of content you guys put off. I've never felt more intellectually outgunned. So thank you. But one of my favorite expressions is always never confuse a clear vision with a short distance. I think the vision as Patrick and Julia has described in terms of a world full of connectivity around IoT and voice-enabled AI that's working continuously around us. I mean, I think that in my mind is a visionary statement, and we are going rapidly in that direction. But it's a long journey, and long journeys are built by everyone, spade work along the way. And so we have, to Patrick's point, we have just begun, but it's going to be an exciting trajectory for sure.
Thanks. Tom, did you have a few final words for us?
Well, thanks to all of you. Jeff, I really don't think you were outgunned, but in any case, you started it with the starter's pistol. So thanks for a great talk. It was really interesting. Kicked off a lot of great discussion. Barbara, fantastic job moderating. Thank you very much. Julie and Patrick, thank you for joining the conversation. I learned a lot as well. Julie said she learned a lot. Well, count me in on that too. So thanks to all of you for participating and making this a really interesting event. To all of our audience, thanks for attending. Appreciate your hanging in there with us. We had some great questions came out of the audience. We're going to be taking a break for the summer. We'll be back in the fall. I believe our first speaker is going to be the Chief Data Officer of the Commonwealth of Virginia. We've got that set up. Invite you all to come and hear that talk. It should be very interesting. And you're welcome, all of everyone, to stay and come into the social lounge and network with